Okay, so good morning and welcome. I am Morgan Roblin, the Conservation Science Manager at the Ontario Land Trust Alliance. Just going to go through quickly what we're doing today. For the first 20 minutes or so, we're going to celebrate the conclusion of OLTA's Climate Action Program, which is funded by the Ontario Trillium Foundation. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome MPP Belinda Carhalios and Ontario Trillium Foundation volunteer Michael Walker to our event, and thank you so much for taking the time to celebrate with us. Following the celebration, we're going to change gears a bit and give a presentation on the role of nature conservation in mitigating climate change. Through OLTA's Climate Action Program, we worked with the communications team to produce a presentation to help land trusts and other organizations communicate this message. So we're going to use that presentation as the foundation of the webinar so everybody can see how it works, and hopefully land trusts and other organizations that are with us today will use it for future webinars. We'll start off today by acknowledging the territory we're on today. Since time immemorial, the Indigenous peoples were self-reliant and well provided for through their ingenuity and use of the gifts of the land, living in harmony with the balance of nature. Ontario Land Trust Alliance acknowledges that the land we meet on and strive to protect is the territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, but now is home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Okay, so thank you again for joining us and welcome to the grant recognition event. This is kind of a bittersweet moment. It's really exciting to celebrate the conclusion of the project, and I'm really excited about all the work that we've done, but it's also sad that it's kind of coming to an end. This work couldn't have been possible without support from the Ontario Trillium Foundation, my colleagues, and our partner land trusts. So thank you all. That being said, I'd like to introduce and welcome our first speaker, MPP Belinda Carhalios, to say a few words.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and good morning, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here virtually, of course, with you today. And I'm very pleased for the invitation. It's fantastic to be able to share this moment with you and to congratulate the Ontario Land Trust Alliance on their initiative focused on building climate resilience in our local communities. The Ontario Land Trust Alliance's initiative, in conjunction with Cambridge's very own Rare Charitable Research Reserve, the Bruce Trail Conservancy, the Thames Talbot Land Trust, and Escarpment Biosphere Conservancy, they're helping conservation and restoration efforts to be better planned and more sustainable for the future. This was, of course, made possible, as mentioned, through over $74,000 in funding from the Ontario Trillium Foundation, specifically OTF's Green People Action Area Grant. As the member of provincial parliament for the riding of Cambridge, which does include North Dumfries and North Brant, I want to thank all of you for all of your hard work, all of your organizations for continuing to work so hard and for making such a positive difference in our communities and across our great province. So thank you so much and congratulations once again.
Okay, thank you so much, Belinda, for those kind words. Next, I'd like to introduce and welcome Michael Walker, a volunteer from the Ontario Trillium Foundation.
Yes, thank you, Morgan, and good morning. I hope you're all keeping safe and healthy during these uncertain times. I know we are up here in North Dufferin, so it's been all good for us so far, hoping we stay the same. Thanks for inviting MPP Carhalios and me to join you online today. My name is, Morgan said, is Michael J. Walker, but everybody knows me as Mike. I'm a volunteer with the Ontario Trillium Foundation from the Waterloo, Wellington, Dufferin grant review team, and I was part of the team that selected your project. I'm happy to be here to learn about the difference your grant has made so far. Even though today's meeting's online, we're all gathered on traditional territory of Indigenous people, and Morgan has done a land acknowledgement, so I will show respect to all of the First Nations that were honored today by Morgan. As you know, OTF is an agency of the Government of Ontario and one of Canada's leading grant-making foundations. And thanks to that fund we received from the Ontario government, we're able to award nearly 650 grants a year to nonprofit organizations across the province. The MPP said in 2019, the Ontario Land Trust Alliance, OLTA, received a $74,000 seed grant to develop the test assess tools and adaptation strategies to increase public engagement in strengthening natural climate solutions. Today, we commend your successes as you help pave the way for better planned and more sustainable conservation and restoration efforts. Thank you for coming to OTF with your idea. I'll make it a point to share the impact of your grant with my fellow OTF volunteers. And finally, thank you for the work you're doing every day to make our community a healthier and more vibrant place for everyone, as well as contributing to a greener Ontario. Congratulations.
Thank you, Michael. So our last speaker for the recognition event is Alison Howson, Executive Director of the Ontario Land Trust Alliance.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. I'd just like to say a few words before Morgan gets started with her webinar. So firstly, thank you very much to MPP Carhalias and to Michael J. Walker for joining us and supporting us, and really appreciate those kind words that you shared with us this morning. We are extremely grateful for the support of the Ontario government through the Ontario Trillium Foundation to support our community climate action program. The climate action project that has been supported through the Ontario Trillium Foundation began out of a volunteer climate action working group, which continues to work tirelessly within and behind the scenes. We are supported by a fantastic group of representatives from our land trust community and from the research community, as well as staff from OLTA's organization. OLTA focuses on empowering and supporting highly effective and well-governed land trusts to help those organizations across Ontario to engage their communities in protecting nature. OLTA specifically works in a number of different areas to build capacity through training and education programs, connecting land trusts to each other, providing resources, sharing knowledge and best practices, helping to reduce financial barriers to land conservation, encouraging Indigenous engagement and collaboration, providing access to current research in the area of land conservation and nature conservation more broadly, and acting as a voice for land trusts among the public, government and stakeholders and other rights holders. Our impact in Ontario is Ontario-wide through 50 or so connected charities and communities. We have local land trust members and associate conservation organizations who collectively own and steward over 108,000 acres across Ontario, and engage in supporting thousands of volunteers and supporters annually to focus on nature conservation and land conservation. The Climate Action Programme, supported by the Ontario Trillium Foundation, has been a fantastic opportunity for OLTA and an opportunity for us to support our land trusts in a new way. We have focused the project on delivery of training to land trust charities to identify potential climate impacts on their properties. We work together to explore ways of increasing the resilience of these nature reserves. As a result, we've planted over 650 trees and shrubs on properties in Cambridge, Arthur and Mulmer to increase biodiversity in pine plantation, for example, to create buffer zones between high traffic roads and tall grass prairie, and to connect fragmented forest patches to increase forest cover. At planting events, we were able to connect with small groups of volunteers to talk about how these actions will increase the resilience of our communities to the impacts of climate change. In addition to the on-the-ground work, we collaborated with an external communications team to develop resources. The purpose of these resources is to promote nature-based climate solutions for Ontario Land Trust Alliance and our member organizations to use and share. You'll learn more about these from Morgan and Jeff in a few minutes. As part of this work, we have also created 3 short videos that feature local land trusts and projects that they are undertaking to increase climate resilience in their communities. Lastly, the presentation we're giving today was developed to help land trusts talk about how the important work they do across Ontario helps mitigate the impacts of climate change in our communities. All of these resources will be available on OLTA's website for land trusts to use in their communications work to help raise awareness of the benefits of nature-based climate solutions. And before I hand back to Morgan, I would like to share with you one of the videos that has been created as part of this project. So Morgan, if I could get you to share that link with us.
Spending time in the woods, seeing the big trees and thinking about how long they've already been on the landscape and all the things they've experienced in the time that they've been here. I just find it really a calming place and an inspirational place. So my name is Daria Kaczynski and I'm the Acting Executive Director at Thames Talbot Land Trust. Right now we're at the Biodiversity Tract. We have 139 acres here that is protected long-term. Land trusts have a really important role to play in combating climate change. One of the most important jobs is that we protect the lands that already do a lot of the work for climate change by sequestering carbon into the plants and soils that are found on the properties. The other aspect that's really sometimes possible is to do restoration projects like the one at the Biodiversity Tract, where we can create more habitat that can then take carbon out of the atmosphere. One of the things that we really looked at is restoring that old savanna type habitat, which used to be present on the landscape, but also we knew had a much better success rate of it surviving and thriving under hotter temperatures and drier conditions. So over time, we hope that this site transitions nicely to a savanna, provides habitat for a lot of these rare species that depend on that type of habitat, and that it's thriving in the future under different climate conditions.
Thank you, Morgan, for sharing that with us. I find the videos and the being able to share the experiences of some of our members has been a fantastic opportunity for us. And this program, as Michael mentioned, was a pilot project, and we have every intention of continuing to develop these collaborations and use these resources to share with our members in future and find new ways and new sources of funding to continue this brilliant program that we have started. We are very grateful for the support of the Ontario Trillium Foundation to support this project and other projects like this, which grow participation and support for community land conservation. Just before I go, I'd also like to acknowledge the recent investment of the Ontario government to strengthen conservation partnerships and preserve more areas of significant ecological importance through the Greenlands Conservation Partnership. This investment will provide a significant contribution to nature-based climate solutions in this province over the next 4 years. Finally, thank you once again to MPP Carl Hallius and the Ontario Trillium Foundation volunteer Michael J. Walker for joining us today.
Okay, thank you everybody. So the last thing we're going to do is try to get a screen capture of the OLTA team and Belinda and Michael. So if everybody wants to turn their cameras on, there we go. Everybody smile. Okay, excellent. All right, so thank you again to all of our speakers for joining us and all the kind words that you said about our project. As I said at the beginning, this is a really bittersweet moment, but I'm really happy with what we've been able to accomplish. For those of you that are unable to stay with us for the webinar, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to celebrate with us. It really means a lot. So now I'm going to pass the floor over to Jeff Driscoll, OLTA's Program and Communications Coordinator, to facilitate the rest of the event. Over to you, Jeff.
Okay, hi everyone, and as Morgan said, I'm the Program and Communications Coordinator for OLTA, and I'll be facilitating the remainder of the Climate Action webinar portion of today's event. So again, I want to welcome everyone, and before we begin, I'm really interested to learn a little bit more about everyone that's attending. So if you could just type in the chat where you're joining from, we'd love to see where everyone's coming from today. Okay, there's a good variety happening here. London, Trenton, Cambridge, Toronto, a few from Toronto, Peterborough, Halliburton. Okay, that's great. Okay, so we can go to the next slide there, Morgan. Okay, so next, I'm going to be providing a brief introduction into our organization, the Ontario Land Trust Alliance, or OLTA for short. But before I dive into that, I first just want to know what everyone's experience or knowledge is with land trusts. So we're going to launch a little poll here. Okay, and the poll should show up on your screen, and it's, do you know what a land trust is? And you can answer yes, no, or kind of. And we'll just leave that up for a minute or so to get everyone's responses. Okay, it looks like we've got mostly everybody, and it seems like most people are familiar with land trusts. So 68% have said yes. Just leave it open for another few seconds here. Okay, so 70% are familiar with land trusts, but for the 30% that are kind of unsure or are not familiar, land trusts are community-based and often volunteer-driven charitable organizations whose core activity is protecting land for natural or cultural heritage purposes. Land trusts across Ontario play a really important role in preserving important private lands and raising awareness of the importance of land conservation. The Ontario Land Trust Alliance, or OLTA for short, established in 2002, is a registered charity that strengthens land conservation in Ontario by building and supporting a strong land trust movement. Next slide. Next slide, Morgan. There we go. Okay. And for OLTA, we're really proud to represent such a diverse and dedicated group. Our membership covers a wide range of Ontario, including north to Rainy Lake and Thunder Bay, east to Cornwall and south to Windsor, which you can see on the map here. We cover a large portion of Ontario, and this map doesn't fully represent everyone. We're working on a project right now to update the mapping, but you can see we cover a large geographical space in Ontario. And overall, we represent 36 member land trusts and 11 associates and other conservation organizations. And together they protect over 103,000 acres of ecologically significant lands, engaging thousands of supporters supporters and volunteers annually, and have a really vital role in meeting Ontario's biodiversity and habitat conservation objectives. Next slide, please. Okay, and OLTA promotes excellence in the land trust community by pursuing three main goals. So reducing financial barriers to land conservation, research and education and excellence, so research, stewardship, and our member programs, and promoting land trust organizational excellence, so training, sharing resources, and encouraging adherence to the standards and practices. And these goals are really aligned and work to sustain our directive of strengthening and advancing land conservation. They guide our decision making and really help us bring closer to realizing our vision for the future. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and just to provide a little review of OLTA's programming and services provided by OLTA. So OLTA's programs such as the Land Trust Conservation Fund Capacity Building Project provides support to land trusts to strengthen their organizational capacity to strive for excellence. Through this program, we host regular training workshops and we have our annual land trust gathering to build a sense of community among land trusts and provide opportunities to gain skills and knowledge and networking. OLTA also facilitates collaboration around kind of big issues in conservation science. Our Conserving Species at Risk program mobilizes land trusts by providing technical and financial support to undertake actions that benefit species at risk. Our Climate Action Program, which is what you're all here today to learn a little bit more about, encourages community learning and action around climate change and adaptation of conservation and restoration efforts to benefit local communities, land trusts, and nature. We also engage the public in environmental outreach, like with our Engaging New Canadians project, which aims to engage newcomers in Canada around conversations about what nature means to them, creating a safe space to learn and connect with natural spaces in Canada and Ontario specifically, and also programming around best practices in land conservation. Next slide, please. Okay, and next I'm just going to provide a little overview or intro, I guess, into the wonderful speakers we have lined up today. So first we'll have Morgan Roblin speak, and she's again the Conservation Science Manager at the Ontario Land Trust Alliance and coordinates OLTA's Climate Action Program. Morgan started her career in land conservation over 5 years ago with the land trust known as the Escarpment Biosphere Conservancy and has never looked back. She is very proud to be a part of such an amazing community of local conservation heroes. Morgan's position at OLTA allows her to work with land trusts across Ontario on projects that support species at risk recovery, biological inventories, and stewardship planning. Following Morgan, we'll have Bob Barnett, who is the Executive Director of the Escarpment Biosphere Conservancy, and a land trust that was formed in 1997 to protect the whole Niagara Escarpment ecosystem. The land trust has since grown to an amazing 183 nature reserves from Caledon to Western Manitoulin and from Godric to Mattawa, primarily along the Huron shore. This 60 square kilometer area protects 62 species of conservation concern, and as the Executive Director, Bob helps conserve a new nature reserve every month or so, which is fantastic. And next slide. Okay, and then we'll be followed up by Jenna Quinn, who is the program scientist at the Rare Charitable Research Reserve, an urban land trust in Waterloo, Wellington, where she facilitates land use research and art projects on the reserve and oversees a long-term ecological monitoring program. Holding a master's in biology and a master's in education and curriculum development, Jenna is always keen to talk about environmental projects, interesting wildlife sightings, and ways to protect and steward our land and planet. And then we'll have Michaela Johnston-Clayton, OLTA's program coordinator, She joined OLTA back in May as an intern while finishing up her master's in environmental science program, specializing in conservation and biodiversity at the University of Toronto. And during her time at OLTA, she's focused largely on OLTA's climate action program. And at this point, I'm going to first off thank all the speakers for coming today. I'm really excited to hear from you, and I'll be handing it over now to Morgan Roblin to talk to everyone about the relationship between land use and greenhouse gas emissions. So take it away, Morgan.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So As you know, today's webinar is going to focus on climate change and nature-based solutions, but I thought it would be interesting to kick things off with a poll. So the question is, when you think about climate change, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? So I'm going to give you a minute to think about it and settle on an answer. And we do have a poll that we'll put up in a minute. I just don't want to lead you into answering a specific way. So Jeff, if maybe we can go ahead and share the poll now. And if the answer that you had in your mind is not on the poll, feel free to type it in the chat. Okay. Sorry, I can't actually see the poll. Jeff, if you want to just hop on and maybe summarize what the results are.
Yeah, no problem. So we've got the majority of people, 61% saying CO2 emissions. And that's followed by 28% saying nature and the environment, and then 11% saying flooding.
Okay, good. So that's really great because what we're going to focus on today is nature and the environment. So the impacts of climate change can often feel overwhelming. It's a really large scale, seemingly long-term issue, although we're experiencing some effects of it right now. But this type of issue often leads to a feeling of helplessness. We don't really know what we can do, or we don't feel like we can make a significant impact on our own. So often what we'll do is not do anything. So the next poll we have here is, do you feel prepared to take action against climate change? Jeff, do you want to pull up the poll? And also summarize the results because I can't see.
No worries.
Thank you.
Okay, we have most of the votes in now. So 63% are saying yes, they feel they have the ability to take action against climate change. About 32% say maybe, and 5% say no.
Okay, so it's good that a lot of you feel like you can and hopefully are doing something to help the environment. And for those of you that don't, or you don't know if you're doing enough, there's a lot that we can do to take action. And one of those things is hiding in plain sight, and it's protecting and restoring our natural spaces. The forests, wetlands, and grasslands and other ecosystems that are scattered across the landscape provide proven ways of capturing and storing carbon, reducing carbon emissions, and helping communities adapt to the impacts of climate change. These are referred to as nature-based climate solutions. And here we have another poll. So before now, I just mentioned it, had anybody heard of nature-based climate solutions, or natural climate solutions they're sometimes referred to as? And Jeff, you can maybe just summarize the results again for me.
Yeah, so we've got the majority of people voted in now. So 89% say yes, they're familiar with the concept of nature-based climate solutions. 11% say no, and nobody's voted maybe.
Okay, so most people have, some of you haven't. Our goal today is to help you understand how protecting nature and stewarding nature contributes to our fight against climate change. We've broken these ways down into 4 major categories in the presentation today. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions, such as carbon dioxide, related to unsustainable land use and land conversion, capturing and storing additional carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, improving resilience of ecosystems by protecting biodiversity and natural corridors, and helping communities adapt to the increase in flooding, dry spells, temperatures, and other impacts that we expect to result from climate change. So I'm going to talk about the first point, which is basically that if we leave nature alone and protect the natural areas that we already have on the landscape, nature can reduce greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide. But unsustainable land use and land conversion, for example, converting a wetland into a subdivision, removes a natural carbon sink from the landscape and creates more greenhouse gas emissions as a result. Land plays a really important role in global cycles of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane. Globally, about 23% of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions comes from unsustainable land uses, like large-scale forestry operations, intensive agriculture, and conversion of nature for development. Additionally, 44% of recent human-driven methane emissions come from intensive agriculture, peatland destruction, and other land-based sources. So we need to keep in mind that any changes in the land and how we use it can affect exchanges of water, energy, and greenhouse gases between the land and the atmosphere. Land and changes in the way we use the land can therefore alter the state and dynamics of the atmosphere, which in turn can mitigate, if we do it right, or amplify local climate change. Human-driven land use at varying intensities affects about 60 to 85% of forests and 70 to 90% of other natural ecosystems. Climate change will exacerbate diminishing land and freshwater resources, increase biodiversity loss, and will intensify societal vulnerabilities, particularly in regions that depend on natural resources for their economy. With this in mind, it's clear that there's an urgent need to stop and reverse the overexploitation of land and our natural resources, which will provide a buffer for the negative impacts of a variety of pressures, including climate change, on ecosystems and our society. While human use, land use is a driver for greenhouse gas emissions, nature also absorbs and stores large amounts of carbon. A variety of climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies exist for carbon dioxide removal. And land trusts across Ontario protect and preserve nature and natural ecosystems. They reduce emissions caused by unsustainable land use by protecting land as it is before it can be altered or changed into something else. These land stewardship, OLTA's Climate Action Program supported the development of stewardship practices to increase carbon storage on nature reserves. These land stewardship options aim to help maintain or increase carbon stores, both above ground in the leaves and trees and trunks of trees and other plant material, as well as below ground in the soils and root systems of plants. Keeping nature on the landscape instead of destroying it is essential in supporting a sustainable future for us and for future generations. So that's it for me. I'm going to pass it back over to Jeff.
Thank you Morgan, for that wonderful overview. We can pause briefly for some questions for Morgan. So if you have any questions, please type them in the chat. So we can just wait a few moments here and see if anything comes in. Okay, and it seems like there's no questions coming in right now, but there will be some time at the end of the webinar as well for questions. So up next, I'd like to invite Bob Barnett on screen, who will be talking about the importance of carbon sequestration. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Bob.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Now we're talking about how land can sequester carbon. So overall, we're trying to get our ecosystems to hold as much carbon as possible and then protect those ecosystems so that we're not losing it. The draft climate program for Grey County, I was asked to consult on that. And I looked at it, and they talk about reducing fossil fuel use, but Grey County, the big forests in Grey County, they didn't even think about the fact that those forests were sequestering carbon. So I had to fight very hard to get carbon sequestration into the Grey County climate fight program. So next slide. So forests are absorbing about 25% of the CO2 from the atmosphere, or from the CO2 pollution produced by humans overall. So in Canada, over a period of about 80 years, an average Canadian tree is absorbing 200 kilograms of carbon dioxide. It's extremely important. So in preparing for this, I actually learned a little bit more about the chemistry, and the photosynthesis affects the leaves, the sunlight, the carbon dioxide comes into the leaves, and it creates sugars. And the oxygen leaves, and those sugars make cellulose, and cellulose is what makes the trunks of trees, and that's what holds the carbon dioxide over the long term. But we have to remember that it's not just the trunks of trees, because trees die and the leaves fall down every fall. So that goes into the soil. So really what we're doing is not only looking after the carbon in the trees, but building a huge soil layer with all the leaves that fall down and the dead trees and the branches that fall down. So the soil is really absorbing a great deal of carbon. Next slide. So wetlands provide a huge amount of carbon sequestration as well. And it's actually, a wetland is absorbing more carbon per acre than a forest. The problem is we don't have a protocol to measure it. They're just starting to develop protocols to look at that in the southern US. But the wetlands are extremely important because they store all this carbon in partly decayed vegetation, and the peatlands up north are extremely important. So the far north is storing about a third of Ontario's total carbon emissions. So they're doing a wonderful job for us, but we really don't understand that very well. So we have to avoid at all costs destroying wetlands because they're huge absorbers of carbon. Next slide. So grasslands and prairies, they're absorbing a huge amount too. That is stored in the soil. So the farmland is storing that, as long as they don't till it every year. You know, all the farmers are more and more using no-till farming. So we're storing more and more carbon in the soil. And once again, we don't have a proven protocol for measuring that, but it is, the grasslands are doing a great job. So 80% of the carbon in grassland ecosystems is actually stored in the soil. So let's just talk about what we can do about it as landowners and land trust people. So our land trust owns about 9,000 acres. And right now we're the only group that's offsetting carbon and selling carbon offsets east of the Rocky Mountains. I'm sure there's lots of groups offsetting carbon, but we're the only one that's actually selling carbon offsets. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about that, and perhaps you can participate with us. So we use what's called an improved forestry protocol, where we compare ourselves. We're dealing with additionality. We have to do something more than what a normal landowner is doing. A normal landowner is cutting his forest every 7 to 15 years, taking out all the mature harvestable trees and sending them off to the mill. Well, a lot of foresters are going to tell you that that's a great thing to do, but I'd just like to emphasize that Canada's forests, run the way they are today, are net emitters of carbon dioxide. They're not absorbing carbon. Net across the whole country, our forests are emitting carbon because of our practices. So we forget that only 15% of harvested wood lasts 100 years. We all think of mass timber buildings and beams and chairs and all these things that are going to last for 100 years, but only 15% complies. 25% of the wood that's harvested goes to toilet paper. Well, it just gets flushed down the toilet, doesn't do any good at all. A whole lot of it is being used for heating and other things like building skids and disposable things. I walk along Bloor Street every night and I see all the paper products that are thrown away, all the shelving that's going out, all the furniture that's going out, all the boxes. I mean, it's it's very frustrating to see all that paper, all that wood going out for nothing. So when you look at a mature forest, it's sequestering over 5 tons of carbon every year for every acre. When you look at a harvested acre, it's only absorbing about 3 plus tons. So there's a difference of 2 tons from our additional good forestry, holding onto the mature trees. So there's 2 extra tons every acre, every year. So we can use a scientifically proven protocol and register those offsets with the Canadian Standards Association, and then we sell them. We sell them to nice people like Desjardins Financial, who buy them at Santa Margarita Wines. They buy our offsets. I've sold them to the Ontario government. So people voluntarily buy these offsets so that they can make themselves more carbon neutral. Now, some people question this, but they're voluntarily imposing a charge on themselves by buying our offsets. So they'll be forced to bring down their carbon use. They're recognizing the fact when they drive a car, they're creating more carbon. So by buying our offsets, that helps us, but they're forcing themselves to decrease the amount of carbon that they use. So we're selling about 14,000 tons every year, and that brings us in $100,000 a year, which for our land trust is a very important source of revenue. It's maybe a third of the money that comes in, so it's very important. So I'm encouraging other land trusts to join up with us and work together. Now, I emphasize that right now there is no protocol for wetlands and there's no protocol for grasslands. So it's only our forested lands that there's an accepted, universally recognized way for selling these things. But if we all get together, let's all make some money and let's all help society offset their airplane travel and offset their car travel and offset their heating, so that we can be part of that picture, and our forests will be recognized and our forests will be subsidized for helping be part of this climate solution. So ready for questions whenever you want.
Thank you, Bob, for speaking really to the importance of carbon sequestration and activities we can take to offset carbon. Again, as Bob mentioned, we have a little bit of time for questions. So if anyone has any questions for Bob, just type them in the chat here and we'll wait a few minutes. Okay, Bob, so we have a question here from Kathy Quinlan asking, is there a dollar amount for offset the same for an old versus younger forest?
Well, that's a really good question. The older a tree is, the bigger it's going to be, the volume, the more leaves, it's going to absorb more and more carbon the older it gets. So trees don't get smaller, they get bigger until ultimately they die. So what we do is we survey with test plots our forest, and we measure the height of the trees and the girth of the trees. So that gives the people who do the modeling for us a pretty good indication of how effectively our forests are gobbling up carbon. So for example, we don't even include in that a tree that's less than 10 centimeters, 4 inches. So a very immature forest doesn't count, but if you're maybe over 20 years old, your forest, then it is going to be counting. And from then on, it gets progressively more and more offsetting ability.
We have another question here from Barbara Heidenreich. First, a comment saying, well done, Bob. And then, what are the actual steps a land trust can take to join you in implementing this?
So the first thing would be to give me a call or let me know that you're interested, because I'm working with our broker, and we're just going to try to initiate another round of measurements and sequestration after Christmas. So hopefully if the land trust let us know, we'll talk about the how to do it, and I'll let you in on all the gory details, because it's quite a bit of work to get this done. So just talk to me and let's get started. I think I've got three land trusts and a conservation authority talking to me right now. So join the party.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question here. So from Sheila Zyman, how many acres of forest would be worthwhile for this program?
I am not sure. If we're pooling our resources, we can probably work with a fairly small number of acres, but 1,000 acres would qualify to get the program started. Maybe even a little bit less than that, but it'd be pretty easy to add another couple of forest plots into what we're doing, and just keep track of that separately.
Hey, thank you, Bob. And I see there
Great.
are a few more questions there, but at the end of the presentation, we'll have some time for questions. And if we don't get to them, we can always direct you to Bob to answer your questions later as well.
Phone me up, give me an email.
All right, thank you, Bob, again. And I'm going to pass on the screen and mic next to Jenna Quinn, who's going to talk with everyone about the importance of biodiversity for maintaining resilient ecosystems. So Jenna, take it away.
Thanks, Jeff. Really pleased to be joining everyone today from my home in Waterloo region. I will be talking about about increasing the resilience of ecosystems to climate change and other environmental disturbances by promoting biodiverse communities and the presence of natural corridors. This is something that's really inherent in the work of land trusts, organizations who are typically strategically acquiring intact biodiverse land parcels, or connecting existing habitats with land bridges, or actively working to restore and increase biodiversity on altered landscapes. This is something I'm familiar with through my work at RARE. With our RARE Sites Land Securement team, they're always working to consider new opportunities to increase existing conservation corridors on the Grand and Aramosa rivers in Waterloo and Wellington. And I want to point out here that this work is not really new. And I think it's important to recognize and offer gratitude to the original stewards of the land here, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples, many of whom not only historically stewarded this land in reciprocity with the planet, which is really what nature-based solutions are, but continue to be land defenders and protectors to this day, here and also across Turtle Island. So let's talk about biodiversity. Biodiversity is the variety of life on Earth at all levels, from genes to ecosystems, and it plays a key role in the function of an ecosystem by providing a multitude of services like nutrient and water cycling, soil formation and retention, resistance against invasive species, pollination of plants, as well as regulation of climate, pests, and pollution. So not only does biodiversity contribute to the healthy functioning of our ecosystems, but it's also a source of human-centric benefits, such as spiritual and aesthetic values, knowledge systems, cultural diversity, and of course, mental and physical health benefits as well, which if we didn't know before in these times of COVID, I'm sure we're all really appreciating those natural spaces in our communities and neighborhoods where we can escape to. I live in an apartment building, so especially early in April and May, I was so grateful to have a trail system and a place like Rare where I could get outside and not feel the walls of my apartment collapsing in on me quite as much as they were for a little while there. Unfortunately, current global biodiversity loss is occurring at an unprecedented rate compared to pre-human background extinction rates. The UN reported just last year that about 1 million species of plants and animals are threatened with extinction worldwide, and many of which could occur this decade. And this is really the worst it's ever been in human history. The average abundance of native species in most terrestrial habitats has fallen by at least 20%, and that's mostly occurred in just the last 30 years. So while we've made some gains in our societal and policy responses to this loss, we really have not been successful at stopping this loss to date. There are a variety of anthropogenic pressures that are causing this threat to our global biodiversity. The number one factor being, unsurprisingly, habitat loss. Simply just less space available for our wildlife to thrive. And of course, other land use changes, habitat fragmentation, overexploitation and rampant consumerism, biological invasion, pollution, and climate change, which has its own direct impact on biodiversity, and it also indirectly ramps up the effects of all of those, or many of those things that I just listed. Climate change affects biodiversity because climate variables like temperature, precipitation, soil moisture, humidity, winds, all of these things largely determine the geographic range of species. Climate modeling scenarios show that these changes will and are resulting in reduced, at times increased, often shifting species ranges. So as the local climate becomes no longer suitable, species that are able to will shift their geographical ranges, generally moving up slopes and towards the poles. This means that they may possibly become locally extinct where they were. And whether a species is able to move elsewhere depends on the dispersal capabilities of the species itself, and consider how a fly or a bird may be able to move versus a tree. So obviously different vectors for dispersion there. And also the availability of natural corridors to support these shifts. And that's an important role that land trusts can play when strategically protecting land that increases connectivity between suitable habitats. So the ability of the species itself to be able to move, and also the presence of safe passageways to support these movements, those are key things here. Picture you can have a car, but if you don't have a road to get where you're going, it's going to be a lot harder to do that. So the concern here is that all of this change will increase an already skyrocketing extinction risk, affect biotic interactions that are crucial for sustaining healthy ecosystems. Consider how delicate and well-timed a lot of biological cycles and services are. Globally, we're seeing breeding times and reproduction windows of frogs and other amphibians, birds, butterflies, and more are changing. Plants have been documented flowering earlier in the spring than what we've seen in past decades. And it seems unlikely that all of these pieces that fit together now will still be able to make these important cycles and services work when they're all being driven to change at different rates. So as such, there's a lot of concern about the stability of both natural and human managed ecosystems, given the current rates of global change that we're experiencing and that are continued to be predicted. It's important to remember here that us as humans depend on many of these goods and services that these ecosystems provide for our livelihood. Where and when we can grow food, catch food, the reliance on natural pollination, the emergence of new pests and diseases. These things are all changing and will continue to change how humans and really entire cultures use the land and waterways to sustain life. So how can increased biodiversity help protect us and protect these systems and interactions then? Well, in ecological communities, species differ from one another in the resources that they use, the environmental conditions that they can tolerate, and in the interactions they have with other species. So the species composition of a community can have a large influence on the overall functioning and stability of an ecosystem. Communities that are more biodiverse are more likely to contain species that will help build that resilience in the ecosystem. Because as a community accumulates species, there's a higher chance for some of those species to have traits that will allow them to adapt to a changing environment. On the flip side, it's also possible in diverse communities to have multiple species that are filling one ecological niche. So they're filling a similar role within the ecosystem, meaning that if you were to lose just one of those species, it wouldn't necessarily have a catastrophic negative impact on the system as much as if you lost a species that was filling a really unique role in the ecosystem. So in both of these cases, having biodiverse species assemblages in your communities can buffer that ecosystem against the loss of some species, the very sure loss of some species that we're going to and are experiencing due to environmental change like climate change. Local actions like what land trusts do to protect or restore habitat and ecosystem complexity and structure can all increase resilience to these resilience of these systems to extreme events by protecting and promoting local biodiversity. Additionally, by ensuring that there are these natural corridors that can connect protected areas, we're enabling species and genes to reach locations where they might thrive despite the challenges that they're experiencing in their current locations and habitats and the change that we're all kind of going through, a whole globe is going through. And this ultimately can contribute to a wider scale climate resilience as well by promoting colonization of new habitats by species, recolonization of habitats where extinction has occurred, and also buffering existing populations against extinction with increased immigration coming from other areas. So land trusts can and do serve the community in a multitude of ways. Often land trusts open up their lands for recreation and enjoyment, trails. Many offer education programs, nature-themed events, volunteer opportunities. The list really goes on and how land trusts can serve their communities. But the real most important role that a land trust fills is the act of protecting these lands and the ecosystems themselves. Often this is proactive before they're threatened or altered. And typically land trusts exist in places like Southern Ontario and Southern BC, where development pressures are high and urbanization is high. Part of my role at RARE is to curate the species list, which is a great joy. And it really never fails to amaze me how quickly we're adding new species to this list, how this list continues to grow. Some of that is increased study, more opportunity to survey and learn. There's always new things to discover and learn. And some of it as well as new species coming into the area. So we get exciting new species, like we recently added an addition of a species at risk bumblebee to our list. And we also get additions to our list that can seem like a warning, like a handful of invasive plants we documented for the first time this year on the Rare Charitable Research Reserve. Increasing and protecting biodiverse ecosystems is one avenue to build resiliency in the face of climate change. And so I'll happily take any questions. And then I think we'll hear from OLTA and Michaela about some other ways that resiliency can fight emerging climate risks and challenges.
Thank you, Jenna, for providing that really great overview of the importance of protecting biodiversity for maintaining not only resilient ecological communities, but also our own human communities, and the really great local actions people can take to be involved to really help with this problem. So like Jenna said, we can pause here for a few moments to see if anyone has any questions for Jenna. So we'll just monitor the chat here for a few moments. Okay, and it looks like there's no new questions right now in the chat, but again, we'll have a little bit of time at the end of the webinar as well. So thank you again, Jenna, and we're going to pass over the mic and screen to Michaela to talk a little bit about how we can better adapt our communities against the impacts of climate change. So Michaela, take it away.
Great, thank you, Jeff. So hello, everyone. So far, we've heard about some really amazing ways that nature helps us in our fight against climate change, from storing carbon to, as Jenna was just talking about, increasing ecosystem resilience by protecting the many species that we share the Earth with. Today, I'll be talking to you all about something that might hit a little bit closer to home for a lot of you, and that is how nature is a really useful tool in helping our communities to adapt to some of these expected impacts of climate change. As the climate changes here in Ontario, we are expected to see not only increasing temperatures, but also things like an increase in the number and intensity of flood events, as well as more frequent and prolonged periods of dry spells or droughts. Now, these are all challenges that many communities are likely to have to face moving forward into the future. And coming up with a solution to such vast and often almost opposite seeming problems can at times feel quite difficult. But I'm here to tell you that there is a simple solution to many of these challenges, and that's nature. Integrating nature into and around our communities can really greatly help to combat and adapt in the face of these climate impacts. I'm going to begin with flooding as an example. So in Ontario, many communities have already begun to see the effects of flooding, and I'm sure that many of you have started to notice these effects within your own communities as well, especially those of you that live in more urbanized areas. As the climate continues to change, flooding is only expected to become more and more of a problem for communities, as extreme rainfall events are expected to become more intense, so bringing about larger amounts of water. These extreme rainfall events are also expected to occur more often. And one reason why flooding is such a big problem in these urban areas is that they are full of surfaces that water isn't able to easily absorb into. So if you think of an urban center, for example, like Toronto, the majority of the landscape consists of things like roads and sidewalks and buildings, which are made up of materials such as pavement or brick, and water's not able to easily pass through these materials. So when it rains, the water still needs to go somewhere. And rather than being easily absorbed into these surfaces and allowed to spread out, more equally across the landscape, what ends up happening is that the water runs off of these surfaces and ends up pooling in a few, often low-lying areas. And when the amount of water that ends up in these areas exceeds what the infrastructure or the natural environment is able to handle, that's when you see flooding start to occur. When you think of a natural area, however, the ground normally consists of something like soil, and this is a material that water can easily be absorbed into. And this really helps to reduce the amount of water that doesn't have anywhere to go and spreads and distributes the water more equally across the landscape, which helps to prevent flooding. In addition to this, the root systems of things like trees and forests and grasses and grasslands really help to increase what we call the soil's porosity. So what this means is essentially that these root systems of plants create more space within the soil, and this then allows the soil to actually hold more water, which offers a place for some of that excess water that we're expected to see with these extreme rainfall events to go. Also, trees, grasses, and other plants that are found in these natural areas also act to reduce and slow the amount of water that even reaches the ground to begin with. So for instance, the canopy of trees, so that's the leafy part of the tree, really helps to intercept rainfall. And in fact, depending on the species of tree as well as the time of the year, a single tree can act to intercept between 10 and 40% of the rainfall that hits it during a rainfall event. As you can imagine, that is a pretty significant amount of water that trees, and especially in the instance of forests where you have many trees, can collect and prevent from even reaching the ground. And this really helps our infrastructure and ecosystems from being overwhelmed with larger amounts of water that they're unable to deal with, which is when we begin to see things like flooding occur. Next slide, please. So another climate impact that our communities are expected to face are dry spells or periods of drought. In Ontario, projected warmer summer temperatures paired with an increased evaporation rate is likely to result in more intense dry periods. This can really have negative effects on things like the water supply to communities and can also act to reduce farmers' crop yields, which can really limit the local food supply. Natural areas like wetlands, for example, can really help to buffer the areas that surround them against the impacts of drought. So, for example, during those extreme rainfall events that I was just mentioning are likely to contribute to increased flooding. Wetlands offer a place to store all of that excess water. And something that I think is really incredible is that a wetland that's as small as 2 hectares, so that's about the size of 2 football fields, can retain water runoff from an area that's 70 times its size. So this excess water from those extreme rainfall events then gets stored within the wetland until it is needed by its surrounding environment. So in the case of drought, where the surrounding environment is expected to become very dry, the wetland acts almost as like a secondary source of water to these environments. And this excess water that was stored within the wetland then is released to those environments and helps to buffer against those effects of drought to the surrounding communities. Next slide, please. So the final impact of climate change to communities that I want to talk to you all about today, and this is probably the one that most people's brains jump straight to whenever they think of climate change, and that's increasing temperatures. So climate change is expected to lead to an increased annual average temperature, and on top of this, it's also expected to result in more very hot days and less very cold days, as well as more frequent and severe heat waves. And now this can really have a negative effect on things like human health, where we may expect to see more cases of things like heat exhaustion or heat stroke, especially in more vulnerable populations like the elderly. Once again, integrating nature into and around our communities is a great way to reduce these climate change impacts. For this, point, I'm going to use the example of trees. So trees offer immense cooling benefits. And a really cool fact is that when placed around buildings strategically, they can actually reduce air conditioning costs by up to 30%. So how do trees act to have these cooling benefits? They do this in one of two ways. So the first is maybe a little bit more obvious, and that's by shading. So the shade from trees acts to reduce the amount of sunlight that hits hard surfaces like buildings or roads, and which is then re-emitted back into the air as heat. And the second way is by this really cool process called transpiration cooling. So essentially, trees release water from their leaves via a process that's known as transpiration. And during this process, water is transformed from its liquid water state to its gas vapor state. And when this process occurs, it actually has this cooling effect on the surrounding air. These cooling effects of trees are just yet another example of how nature can really help us to adapt to climate change impacts, and really shows how even on a small scale, so here we were just talking about a single tree, nature can really have these immense benefits. I just want to finish off this portion of the webinar just by restating that idea that nature is one of our greatest defenses in our fight against climate change, and that going forward, this really just shows how important incorporating and protecting nature into and around our communities really is. Thank you, and if anybody has any questions, I am happy to answer those.
Hey, thank you, Michaela, for really putting into context the importance of helping our communities adapt to the increasing impacts of climate change. Like Michaela said, we do have a few moments now for any questions, so just pop them in the chat and we'll monitor now for a few moments. Okay, and it doesn't look like there's any new questions in the chat right now. Again, we'll have a few moments at the end of the webinar, so stay tuned for that. So thank you again, Michaela. And up next, we're gonna switch the mic and switch the mic and screen back to Morgan to conclude the webinar for us and talk a little bit about the importance of protecting and restoring and respecting nature.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. And thank you to our speakers. That was really informative, and I hope we all have a better understanding of the role of nature in mitigating climate change and all the different things it does to us. So, beginning of the session, to ask you this question again. Another poll to go up. Jeff, if you want to share the poll, and you can comment on the results again for me.
Oh, sorry, I don't think there's another poll actually.
Oh, okay. Well then, never mind. Well, hopefully you all know the answer that you all would have given was that you do know what nature-based climate solutions are now. So, it's really important that we all consider the role we play in mitigating climate change and understand, and understand that we need nature to support healthy, vibrant communities and a sustainable future. Protecting, restoring, and taking care of nature is one way that we can do this. If you'd like to get involved in supporting nature, you can get in touch with your local land trust. So we had a few representatives from the land trust community talk today. I know there's a lot of land. So there's land trusts all across Ontario, a lot of them are based in Southern Ontario, and there's also other nature conservation groups that you can get in touch with. These organizations really depend on your support. We need volunteers to champion on-the-ground efforts like tree planting events, invasive species removal, seed collection, trail building, and trail maintenance, among a lot of other things. Volunteers also play a big role in monitoring nature reserves to identify any threats and hopefully help the land trust mitigate those threats. And if you want to do something at home, and I think some people have already mentioned this during the presentation, and if you're lucky enough to have a garden or a backyard, planting native species is a really great thing to do. Native species support, or native plant species support a lot of native pollinators like bees, butterflies, birds, and other wildlife. And if you're like me and Jenna and you live in an apartment, you can maybe try to force native plants on your friends and family that do have gardens and backyards. Lastly, there are a number of things that we can all do in our daily lives that will support and reduce our impact on the environment. Being a conscious consumer and supporting sustainable businesses and organizations is really important. Trying to reduce the waste and, keeping an eye on what types of packaging the products that you're buying use. Is it, a plastic wrapped thing that has a lot of plastic wrapped things inside? Maybe there's an opportunity to buy a different product. Also pay attention to the other waste that you produce by maybe buying too much food or buying too much of a specific thing. Think about your diet and ways that you can change it to reduce your impact on the land. Lastly, you can try to limit your travel. If I know right now during COVID, we're all doing a really good job not going anywhere, not flying anywhere. So that's been really good for the environment, but obviously this isn't going to be the way that we live forever. So when we are able to travel again, maybe just think hard about whether you need to go on that vacation or that road trip. And if you do, everybody deserves a vacation. Everybody deserves to treat themselves. Think about ways that you can offset your footprint. So Bob mentioned a really good way of doing that, which is supporting land trusts and buying carbon credits to offset your footprint. So yeah, these programs like that land trusts run are really important in supporting nature conservation across Ontario. And I think we have a final poll. Jeff, do we have a final poll?
No, there's no final.
Okay. Okay, so lastly, I hope that everybody now feels that there is something that we can all do to take action against climate change. Whether it's a small thing or a big thing, it really doesn't matter. It all makes a big difference in the end. So that's the end of this portion of the presentation. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. As I said at the beginning, this presentation was created as part of our climate action program, and it will be available for land trusts and other organizations to use to communicate the way that the work that you do supports a sustainable future and helps us mitigate climate change. In addition to this presentation, we have other resources coming to you. Allison shared one of our shorter videos at the beginning of the presentation, and we've got 2 more coming up. I won't show them to you, but they will also be available on the website. We have developed an infographic to kind of help communicate the messages that we've covered here today, focusing on the role of land conservation and land trusts in Ontario in mitigating climate change. And finally, and I kind of mentioned this earlier on, we worked with 4 land trusts to train our abilities to climate change. And we did this using a an assessment tool that OLTA developed with the help of our working group and many others. So that tool is in its final stages, and the tool along with the user guide is also going to be available to help you look at your properties, identify where the most vulnerable areas are, and explore ways that you can implement management actions to increase resilience of the ecosystems on your land, as well as the resilience of your communities. So I am going to end it off there and pass it back over to Jeff.
Thank you, Morgan. At this time, I think I'm going to invite all of our lovely speakers back on screen, and we'll open the floor for a few more minutes to answer any lingering questions. So again, please type these in the chat if you have any. We have about 7 minutes left of the webinar, so we have a little bit of time. So I'm just going to open up the chat and see if there's been anything new in here. Okay. Okay, so we have a question from Barbara Heidenreich again. So how do we convince governments of the importance of the role of land trusts in mitigating climate change? Would a presentation to local councils help after every election? Is there an OLTA template for a PowerPoint presentation that describes land trusts and their role?
I can partly answer that at least. Yeah, I think that's a great point, Barbara. And I know at RARE, this is something we've made a point of doing. We are in two-tiered cities. So we have a regional council, and also Kitchener, Cambridge, and Waterloo each have a council. So we have made a point of going and presenting at each council about the importance of RARE and land trusts and the role. I think that that's something we would encourage all land trusts to do. And you could contact your local land trust and see how you could support them doing that. It always helps when you can get a lot of citizens to come and support you when you're doing a delegation at council. So having people there is great allyship in that way. So if your local land trust hasn't been doing that, remember a lot of land trusts are not large. They don't have big staff. So having champions come in and say, this is something I want to help you with is really great to do. And if you're fortunate, you will find that your councils and cities are there to support you. We've been well supported by our region. You heard us start today with Belinda, who I was touched. You could see that she's proud to be in an area that has RARE there. RARE is considered to be quite a jewel for the city of Cambridge and the region of Waterloo, and we want that to be reflected in all of our political leaders. We want them to be out there championing RARE as well because of everything we talked about today, all the added value. So anything you can do to help your land trusts do that, I think is great. Oh, and yes, the 5% parkland dedication. I'm not super familiar with that, so I'll leave that, Barbara, but I'll look into it.
And I'd just like to add that this presentation, as you saw, there's not a lot of text in it. So land trusts could potentially use a presentation like this to just change what you're actually saying during each slide to tailor it to your organization, to what you specifically do in your community. So you can touch on those 4 points, the nature-based solutions, and try to connect it more with the work that you're doing on the ground in your local area.
We have another question here from April asking, with COVID and impacts to the economy and Ontario wanting to grow, do you think this will make it more difficult to convince governments and municipalities?
Good question. I think with COVID, what we're seeing, I don't want to say this because maybe it's not fact checked, but somebody told me that 5% of national donations in Canada are directed towards environmental organizations, environmental nonprofits. Again, fact check. I don't know if that's true, but I think that's probably true, that it's a lower percentage. And so what we're seeing, a big impact that land trusts, which are charities and nonprofits, see is that the impact of COVID is obviously less donations. People are being charitable still, I believe, but often redirected towards, things that are more directly impacting people right now with COVID, healthcare and food banks and social services and things like that. So we are seeing an impact in that way. But as we talked about today, the presence of nature, I mean, with COVID, we saw it in the spring. In April, our trails are always busy in April because it's spring and people are keen to get outside, but they were so busy this year. People were desperate to find outdoor spaces. And I think a lot of people had their priorities and shift this year, their understanding of what's important to them. And so, right now, we're still kind of in crisis mode. People are dealing with the immediate impacts of COVID, and that's super important. But I'm hopeful that over the long term, this crisis will help, will have a lasting impact on how people value the things in our society. And so hopefully we can really build on that and keep that momentum going. I think even like Morgan referred to earlier today, we're seeing a lot of positive things come out of COVID because we're all staying home and we're hunkering down a little bit more. We're traveling less, we're driving less, all of those things. But let's continue to build on that post-COVID and how we can continue to live our lives more sustainably and make sure that we're valuing the things that we value most, like nature.
Yeah, thanks, Jenna. And I'd also like to say, I know Allison kind of touched on it during the event at the beginning of the session, but we have recently got support from the provincial government to support protection of land, specifically to support land trusts and their land acquisition activities. And OLTA is also working with a larger coalition, the Southern Ontario Nature Coalition, and that is formulating a strategy to build and create a nature network, specifically in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. So hopefully projects like that will, I mean, we're working with municipalities and getting input from government on that project. So hopefully we'll see good things happening in the future.
Thank you, Jenna and Morgan. Just keeping an eye on time, we're at 11:30, so we're going to close questions for now, and this will kind of mark the end of our presentation component today. I'd like to take a moment to say thank you very much to all the speakers that shared their knowledge today. So Morgan Roblin, Bob Barnett, Jenna Quinn, and Michaela Johnston-Clayton, and the Ontario Trillium Foundation as well. And a huge thank you to all of you that joined us today for the workshop. Thank you for voting in our polls. Thank you for asking engaging questions. And we really hope that you learned a lot today about climate action. We're going to wrap up now, but I just want to mention we popped in the chat there a link to provide feedback for our webinar today. So if you have a moment, please fill out that feedback. We'd really like to incorporate that into our next workshops that we plan for to really make sure that they're engaging and meeting your needs. We'll also be following up with this information in a post-webinar email as well. And the recording for this webinar will be made freely available on our YouTube channel later. So again, thank you again to our lovely speakers and everyone watching. We hope you have a lovely Friday and weekend. Stay safe, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye, thank you.